Hello and welcome to a video where I talk about DMC4 Vergil and why it disappointed me. Before I start, I'm going to be talking about why I'm making this video and why I'm making it so late. This all started when DMC4SE was announced. As soon as I saw the first teaser, I had a feeling that Capcom will somehow fuck it up. Capcom has not had the best track record in the past couple of years, especially with the whole debacle of the DMC reboot. This is why my first commentary ever on this channel, which is now deleted, put a strong emphasis on being a little bit concerned and not too hyped about DMC4 Special Edition. And then we finally got footage through the gameplay trailer and other sources, and needless to say I was pretty damn hyped and I couldn't wait to play Vergil. But based off this new information, I had a couple of concerns. I expressed my hype and some of these concerns in a DMC4 Special Edition trailer analysis video, which is a mouthful. Some of those concerns were later confirmed to be true, such as embedded swords for Vergil. Finally, we get some streams provided by Capcom Unity, as well as more information from a variety of different sources, mainly from the DMC4 Special Edition website. It was at this point in time when I started to record a commentary concerning Vergil, but I never uploaded this commentary, and the main reason was because DMC4 Special Edition was going to be released in a few weeks. I just needed to wait a few weeks in order to get my hands on the game, and then I could properly dissect it, and hopefully my concerns would be fixed or have a way to be fixed properly. Finally, it was released, and I'm afraid to say that most of my criticisms remain the same. Nevertheless, ever since then, I've been meaning to do a DMC4 Special Edition critique video, in which I list all the issues that I had with the game. I wrote down a pretty lengthy outline. For that, a commentary like this, which I haven't written down anything for, would be inappropriate. So I decided to write down a script, but I'm really bad at writing. I just hate, I don't have the discipline for it. But I still wanted to do this, and because Vergil was the biggest subject in that video, I might as well rush a Vergil critique. Basically, these thoughts have been in my head for quite a while now, and I have never fully explained them in depth. Another reason why I'm making this video is because I'm not gonna have much time to work on DMC related content and videos. The final major reason why I'm making this video is because there seems to be a couple of idiots out there who seem to misunderstand when referring to the issues with DMC4 Vergil. Anyways, let's begin. There are several types of critiques I have concerning Vergil. One type are things that I would have liked to see for Vergil but were never implemented into previous DMC entries. This is perhaps the weakest type and it's the most subjective. There are things that they implemented from previous games that I do not like and find it detrimental to the combat system, as well as things that they forgot to add from previous entries that could have made Vergil better, or just new counterintuitive things. Also, I'm going to be pointing out things that are very small and don't really matter too much to me. So let's start off from the little things. One of the first things I noticed about Vergil is that the weapon switching is reversed compared to DMC3 Vergil. This is something the developers do that I hate, which is to make subtle changes or big changes to the control inputs that are not necessary. I had and still have the same problem with DMC4 Dante. Just compare Beowulf from DMC3 to Gilgamesh from DMC4. I mean, why is Fullhouse's launcher forward plus style on the analog stick? And DMC3 was backwards on the analog stick and melee. And this used to be something that really messed me up whenever I started switching between two games. Now it doesn't bother me anymore, but it's something that consumes your time for no reason. The good thing is that DMC4 allows you to change your control layout, and you could swap the triggers so that you don't have to rewrite your muscle memory if you play DMC3. Sadly, the weapon switching display is reversed, so it could sometimes mess you up if you rely on the HUD for learning new techniques. The good thing is that once you got a technique, you don't really have to look at the HUD, and you just get used to it. It would be great if somebody could mod the weapon switching HUD to match that of DMC3 Vergil. There is also no rising sun. It's only connected to the last few hits of DT Kick 13. There have been many people who complain about it. Personally, I don't have such a huge issue, but it was a very cool move that I think should have been back in melee for Vergil instead of his current uppercut. Also, if Vergil went to the ground on the last hit of aerial lunar phase, that would have been slightly better. That way you could jump cancel and do it like normal lunar phase right now, or you have the option to touch the ground using lunar phase. That adds a little bit of depth. Not a huge issue. Then again, it's very useful for speedrunning. Would have liked to do multiple judgment cuts like in DMC3. There's a judgment cut glitch you could do that allows you to do something similar, but it's not that practical, even for combos, in part because of its slow speed. It's very difficult to do and it just doesn't look as good. Other people have asked for this, but again, it is not such a huge issue for me because I think they did a good job with judgment cuts in this game. Any changes that I would do would be to make normal judgment cut a little bit faster, mainly because the backwards dash has potential for movement and positioning, but the time between the animation start and the judgment cut is a little bit too long, and to balance it, just lower the damage and stun. Next is to be able to shoot summon swords throughout the entire animation. Make it properly reversible without having to create a huge distance between you and the enemy. And that's it. That's why this isn't such a huge problem. But you know, man, it's just I'm just putting it out there for possible DMC5. Holla at your boy, DK. Need money. Help. Donate. There's no follow-up knockback attack for Vergil's upper slash like in Devil May Cry 3. They could have even added an ability to pop the summon swords in the enemy like DT'd rapid slash. When you taunt or do judgment cut end, you cannot air trick like normal. You have to cancel it with jump and then do air trick. Also, why can't I shoot while I'm taunting? I also miss aerial rave from DMC3, and at the very beginning I didn't think his normal combo would have a lot of range, but it turns out that in max concentration it really is pretty sick. So although I miss the look, it still has a similar feel. Plus Vergil now has an aerial launcher, so that's cool. Spiral swords can be annoying, but I think that is more of an executional issue, because oftentimes I find myself doing spiral swords instead of sword storm or blistering swords. But again, that's a very small problem. Also, I wish sword storms didn't launch the enemy too high up. It is definitely useful for practice and certain combos, but I would have preferred if the launch distance matched a normal upper slash or that of the reboot Vergil. Would have been great if blistering swords did a little bit less damage but shot at a slower but consistent rate, so that it keeps enemies in the air longer. One of the main reasons people use blistering swords in DMC3 or in DMC is to keep the enemy in the air while you're doing a bunch of attacks or moves that do not hit the enemy. But outside of Alto Angelos and Frost, blistering swords utility sort of drops off because you could easily do a bunch of summon swords that will keep the enemy in the air. However, it looks a lot more neater and precise if you use blistering swords instead of just shooting a bunch of summon swords at an enemy. You also have a ton of different things that would keep the enemy in the air. But now we're going to talk about more moderate to severe shortcomings with the character. This one is a little bit less necessary, but DMC Vergil had Doppelganger, and that increased the depth dramatically. It would have been great to see it make a comeback for Vergil in Devil May Cry 4. Although I will admit, it's kind of weird to see Vergil have Doppelganger instead of Dante. I don't know why they, well, the DLC did have its reasons. I would have also liked to see DMC Vergil's projectile launcher make it into SE. It just added another layer of depth, almost like ecstasy for Dante. One thing that I would have liked to see implemented was horizontal teleports in the air, like DMC Devil May Cry with aerial evades, because as it stands, Vergil's aerial horizontal movement is rather limited unless you have DT Stinger, or if you're at the same height as the enemy but you're far away and then you air trip. And as seen by DMC Devil May Cry combo videos, Vergil players make good use of it. Now some people might say, well, how do you implement that into the controller, especially if you want trick up and trick down tied to the style button, which I'll get into later. All I can say is that you have a whole fucking D-pad empty, and you can definitely move the analog stick left and right to do horizontal trickster dashes left and right, and perhaps back to forward inputs if you want to move forward and back. On the subject of horizontal movement, why is Vergil's Stinger this short? Why couldn't it have worked like Nero's Caliber, where if you're very close up to the enemy, it will hit instantly. But if the enemy is away, Nero will travel a certain distance until it hits an enemy. This could have added a ton of depth. It is one of Nero's most versatile moves, so it would have obviously increased the depth and skill ceiling for Vergil. Now this is a problem that other people have, but I do not have, which is that Starfall knocks back instead of just stun, like in previous games. Their argument is that they can't jump cancel a bunch of Starfalls consecutively, or switch between a Starfall, jump cancel, aerial rave, Starfall, and you get the point. Although I understand why this argument is made, I still think that the knockback can be a good and a bad thing. But overall I like it because it gives a lot of movement to the gameplay. If you jump cancel and do aerial ray fast enough, you'll catch the enemy before it flies away. You can also do a bunch of summon sword magic to keep the enemy close. If they could implement a way in which you can control whether Starfall knocks back or stuns, that would be great, but I really don't know how they would do that. Ultimately for me it's just a non-issue. What I do think is a missed opportunity though is that it doesn't generate inertia. Even though it's unlikely to be widely applicable with Vergil, I think that it would still have been a nice addition for the character. I mean, imagine if Kick 13 for Vergil actually carried the inertia from Starfall like with Dante. That would have added just a little bit more depth to the game that may or may not have been widely used. I have a similar problem with Trish as her aerial rave cancels inertia. But yeah, now I'm gonna talk shit about Vergil's teleports. So first of all, let's examine Vergil's trick up. So trick up up is actually pretty damn cool. The move is pretty much completely cancelable. You can do a bunch of cool things, like for example, you can trick up then right after do Starfall or Helmbreaker. This allows you to do those moves very close to the ground, and it's really spammable as well. This is great because a lot of his moves have a height limit, which means that, for example, you can't do aerial raid below a certain point, which can be quite annoying, but Vergil's trick up manages to avoid this, and it's pretty consistent to do, with inputs very similar to jump canceling. If you leave the analog stick neutral, you will trick straight up, but if you're moving the analog stick, Vergil slightly moves to that direction. It also generates a little bit of inertia, which does increase the gameplay depth, if only slightly. It can sometimes look a little bit goofy in comparison to the trick up for Devil May Cry 3 or DMC, but I mean, it has a lot of good mechanics, which ultimately matters more. So you might be wondering, well DK, what's so bad about this move? You're telling us a lot of cool stuff about it. Well, first let's see how it's executed. In order to do this move, you need to press the trick button, which on default control layout is circle. And that's it. In Devil May Cry 3, Vergil's trick up was bound to lock on forward on the analog stick and the style button, which is Darkslayer, which translates to the trick button in Devil May Cry 4. However, in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition, as I said before, pressing the trick button will allow you to trick up. The problem is, if you have a sword embedded into the enemy, you will air trick instead of trick up. Once a sword is embedded into an enemy, there's not many ways you could trick up. You can do Judgment Cut End, let go of lock on and just press trick, or you can taunt, let go of lock on and press trick. In both scenarios, you will be able to trick up. And in the air, I've seen footage of people being able to do trick up while a sword is embedded into an enemy, but it seems to be exclusive for consoles. Had they used the input methods of Devil May Cry 3 for trick up, this would not have been a problem. It would have added more depth to the game because you don't have to depend so much on those limited scenarios that I have described. And plus it would just be easier and not needlessly difficult. Hell, even if they used the D-pad for Vergil's trick up, it would still be better than not having that option easily available. I mean seriously, just the movement options you have with air trick would have given him more setups for his combos, as well as evasion options outside of DT, which I'll get into in a little bit. So now that trick up is done, let's talk about air trick and embedded swords. You see, when the announcement trailer was released, I noticed something. I noticed that there was a summoned sword stuck to an enemy, and I was pretty certain, and it turns out I was right, that they took the embedded sword mechanic from DMC Devil May Cry into Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. So what are embedded swords? Embedded swords first appeared in Virgin's Downfall. You see, in order to air trick, you were required to shoot a summoned sword at an enemy first. It was also a requirement to pull enemies, but that doesn't exist in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition. It would be interesting to see that though, but I'm not sure, it looks kinda funky. Now there are two main possible reasons why they needed this. So first off, in DMC Devil May Cry, air trick also cancels animations, so I assume they required embedded swords so that it wasn't so easily spammable and exploitable. Needless to say, it's a very shit way of going about things. Oftentimes you thought you put an embedded sword into an enemy, but no, you didn't. And now you're going to get hit, because it takes the summoned sword a fraction of a second in order to reach your enemy. And by then, bam, you're dead. But at least DMC had horizontal evades. The second reason is simple. It was to compensate for the game's lack of lock-on. You see, you're likely to shoot an embedded sword to an enemy that you were comboing on. So if somehow there's distance created between you and the enemy, you can rest assured that if the enemy had an embedded sword, you will air trick to it. So basically, without the embedded sword mechanic in DMC Devil May Cry, every air trick in a room full of enemies has a higher likelihood of targeting the wrong enemy. This is the case even if you use the analog stick quote-unquote properly, because the analog stick is not very precise. And if you somehow have your doubts about that, I encourage you to go into the game, whether it be DMC Devil May Cry or DMC4, and just use Ebony and Ivory and try to destroy objects from far with the analog stick only. Good luck, fucking idiot. And assuming that the analog stick was very precise and people could reasonably be precise with it, if there are two enemies in front of you in the same direction, the analog stick isn't gonna help you, sorry about that. Especially if they are at different heights. So one enemy is on the ground, the other one is in the air, who knows which one is gonna choose. I'm just putting that out there because there are a couple of idiots who have argued in the past that lock-on in Devil May Cry isn't necessary and it's clunky, which is quite hilarious, and I should have made a video about that a long time ago, but I didn't. Now, as you can tell, Devil May Cry 4 has lock-on, so why is embedded sword there? And it's not very useful to limit the amount of tricks you could spam, like in DMC Devil May Cry. You see, I forgot to mention something. In DMC Devil May Cry, if you embed a sword and then trick, you'll need to embed another sword and trick. Whereas for Devil May Cry 4 Vergil, the embedded sword doesn't go away after you trick once. It goes away after a certain amount of seconds, but honestly I think it's a better choice to do this. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't work like in DMC Devil May Cry, because I'd be pretty fucking pissed off if every time I needed to trick, I would have to put an embedded sword. Still though, it shouldn't have been implemented at all. There is no need for it, and it just needlessly complicates things. For example, if you're practicing a technique that requires a lot of air tricks, such as judgment cut cancels, you'll often find yourself screwing up a technique because you forgot to shoot a summoned sword right after the embedded sword disappeared. So sometimes it can make very thought out combos, gameplay, or just practice annoying. Making sure that there's an embedded sword in an enemy at all times is something that you could definitely train yourself for, but here's the thing, I shouldn't have to learn how to avoid the negative consequences of a shitty mechanic. I've also encountered another problem which I actually first found out from the Capcom Unity streams, and it's this. When you lock on and trick and the enemy doesn't have an embedded sword, it automatically shoots an embedded sword for you. Now if you're in a room filled with enemies, and you want to air trick to an enemy that is far away and has not had any embedded sword into it, sometimes another enemy might jump into the trajectory of your summoned sword, and instead of air tricking to the enemy that you wanted, to the enemy that you're locked on, you will air trick towards the enemy that embedded sword landed on. Needless to say that whenever this happens, it's pretty rage-inducing. Either that or it's funny as hell. The only real time where I could see it being beneficial to the gameplay is when you have to let go of lock-on for perhaps a reverse attack and move away at a significant distance. In this case, you will always air trick towards that enemy that has an embedded sword unless other enemies have an embedded sword as well. But as you can tell, this doesn't really compensate for its failures. Perhaps one way they could have made it useful to balance the game for Vergil is to allow Vergil to air trick without the embedded swords, but if he wants to travel at long distances or spam air trick faster, he'll need embedded swords. And even this idea doesn't really sound that great to me, but no, it's much better, I think, than its current state. Now everybody knows that Vergil is overpowered, except in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition he's very overpowered. And one of the reasons he's overpowered is surprisingly his air trick. His air trick allows you to cancel almost any animation at almost any given point in time. This is something that was taken from DMC Devil May Cry, and something that I fully supported. Even before DMC Devil May Cry, I thought about this mechanic for Vergil, and even for Dante. It just allows for so much more possibilities with the characters. The problem is though that in DMC4 Vergil, you can spam it pretty hard. This is one of the things that destroys the game's balance. Vergil is able to stay in the air for as long as he wants, with minimum effort, and pretty good efficiency. There are definitely ways that enemies can hit you in the air, but being in the air is generally safer than being on the ground. Much safer. This is my other problem with Swordstorm. It allows you to be ridiculously high in the air, easily. It is at this point where I reach a dilemma. I really love the freedom that air trick gives to you in this game, but on the other hand, I can understand when people say that air trick is overpowered, and it definitely makes things a lot easier, and can definitely be used as a cop-out when you're feeling lazy. Ultimately, I think game balance is more important. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms I had with DMC Devil May Cry is that it's way too easy to stay in the air. In short, things shouldn't be needlessly difficult. The key word is needlessly. If the difficulty arises from an increase in gameplay depth, such as how lock-on gives you more moves, but executing those moves is harder than just simply pressing one button, that is understandable. It is also understandable for the most part to increase the difficulty of executing something if it is for the sake of balance. This is why being consistent at Royal Guard is so difficult, because if it were that easy, beating the game with its set challenges would be easy. And in this case, either you buff the hell out of the enemies for aerial attacks, or you make it harder to stay in the air. However, making changes this late into the meta development is sort of suicide. This means that any nerf that is made will not be welcome because so much is already dependent on something as big as air trick. Even with DMC Devil May Cry, I would not advocate a nerf for something crucial. For example, making jump cancel not stun, like in previous Devil May Cries, and therefore make it harder to stay in the air, would be a bad thing, and a lot of people would be against that, and justifiably so, because so much technology in that game is dependent on that stun jump cancel. This is why it's very important for developers to have everything balanced and set before the game is shipped. So this is slightly related to air trick. As you know, air trick cancels almost everything, completely in a way that no other cancel could compete. Unless you have certain special conditions, you'll always end up close to the enemy after an air trick. This is great, but what if you want to cancel a move from a distance and keep your positioning? For that, you want to cancel air trick. The thing is that there are many ways to cancel air trick. There are two main types of air trick cancel. One is canceling with judgment cuts. This will cause Vergil to do an aerial judgment cut, sometimes with inertia, or sometimes do an aerial perfect judgment cut. But if you want to cancel air air trick without leaving the ground. The special double button input moves will do the job. This means Judgment Cut End, Drive, and Kick 13 can be used to cancel air trick. For these moves you have to press trick and then melee. This is likely why they gave these moves the ability to cancel air trick, because every time you would want to execute these moves with an embedded sword, you would teleport instead. And assuming the move came after the air trick, you'd put yourself in a very dangerous situation, as you are not close to the enemy. This is especially the case for Vergil's Judgment Cut End. So why exactly am I complaining about this? It's simple, I hate double button inputs for moves. They should be absolutely last resort for when everything else in the controller is taken over. Something like lock on, back to forward, and attack are much less cumbersome than a double button press input. This is especially the case if you have a custom control layout, in which the buttons are very spaced apart, say square and circle. I even wanted a back to forward input for Drive with Dante, but because it's a double button press input, and because my control layout is kinda weird, I don't use it often. And again, Vergil's D-pad looks kind of lonely. If they move away from the double button inputs, they could have still preserved its ability to cancel air trick. Now let's talk about trick down. So if I'm not mistaken, in the Capcom Unity stream, they showed us that trick down actually requires DT. Now I cannot believe how retarded this fucking thing is, and I know why they did it, and I'll explain why in a bit, but let me just focus on why this is a problem. So in Devil May Cry 3 and in DMC, Vergil did not need DT to trick down. So already there was something that was made needlessly complicated. Now, besides the obvious reason of DT being wasted on for something that didn't require it in the past, DT also has a cooldown in between activation and deactivation. So if you don't want to be in double trigger for too long, whether it be because you want to conserve meter, or maybe you think that Vergil does a lot of damage while on DT, which I'll get into that fucking later, you can't just activate and deactivate DT whenever you want, even if you had infinite DT. There is still that cooldown you have to worry about if you're doing it often. And plus it's just another button that you have to worry about pressing, which can be exacerbated if you have a weird control layout. My double trigger for Devil May Cry 4 Vergil is on circle, and although for me it's not such a huge issue because I have other characters with double trigger on one of the face buttons, it again still needlessly complicates things. I assume that they made DT a requirement for Vergil's trick down and side tricks because they are pretty quick and cover a lot of distance and have some invincibility frames. So they perhaps thought it was going to be overpowered if it weren't in double trigger. However, they could have just made it slower, cover less distance, and have a longer recovery time, maybe less iframes, and boom! Simple solution for an easy problem. Or they could have just added a cooldown and have the players bypass it somehow to spam them, but it takes some amount of skill. DMC Devil May Cry did this, and what I'm suggesting is pretty much similar to Dante and his guard cancel dashes, but I think they could have came up with something similar to those examples. That would mean that Vergil would have more evasion options, while those evasion options take a bit of skill to execute. And in certain situations, Vergil really does need this. A good example would be Burial, where he has attacks with a huge area of effect, such as the fire pillars or his explosion, whose active frames seem to last quite a long time. This makes air trick as a method to avoid damage unreliable, so your ground tricks are your best bet, but they're tied down to DT. So if the fire pillars appear and you don't have DT, you're gonna have to run around to avoid those pillars, which looks like shit and also hurts Vergil's concentration. I'll also get to that later. Another problem is that the inputs for trick down is lock on backwards on the analog stick and jump. As I said before, I don't like changes that do not add anything to the game, and that now I have to rewrite my muscle memory for. Why wasn't this made into lock on backwards on the analog stick and circle like in Devil May Cry 3? And I'm pretty sure I know why. You see, with Nero, when you do table hopper, you move the analog stick towards the left or right and input jump at the right moment of an enemy's attack. And the ground tricks for Vergil are pretty much identical, except you don't have to worry about timing it. You could just do it whenever you want, as long as you're in DT. But the main issue I have with this is that it can conflict with jump cancel. So for instance, if I want to jump cancel Stinger and do a backwards inertia rave, it is very likely that it will trick down instead of jump cancel off the enemy. This happens often with max concentration DT Stinger, as if your Stinger hits the enemy, it is cancelable with trick down. Had it not been for trick down being tied down to jump, this would have been easier and would have been more widely applicable. You can bypass this by letting go of lock on when you jump, but you will have to practice re-locking on in time so that the rave is not reversed, or move the analog stick back towards the enemy quickly. Or sometimes you want to trick down but jump cancel instead, Had DT not been a requirement, this problem would have been much more of an issue. I know this because I used to play Vergil with a mod that removed the DT requirement only, and I would get a slower trick down, but that slowness often meant that I would do a jump cancel instead. Also, one small issue, sort of, is that his ground tricks are tied to frame rate. The problem with this is that if you play at 120 FPS and you do a side trick, you don't really move that much. It can of course be a good and a bad thing depending on what you're going for, but I think that is a little too short. The ground trick down is pretty much alright, but it's really the side tricks that are a problem. You could of course still play at 60 FPS, and I think most players prefer 60 FPS for a few reasons here and there, but both 60 FPS and 120 FPS have their pros and cons. Okay, now let's talk about the concentration meter. In the past I have stated that the concentration meter is an overhyped piece of shit, and I still don't take that back. The concentration meter, also known as the motivation meter, which already it's strike one Capcom, why didn't you call it the motivation meter? No, I'm just kidding. Is what I assume the developer's way to make you play like Vergil. There are 3 levels to this concentration meter. Generally speaking, at the lowest level your attacks have little range and little damage. This hitbox size and damage is dramatically increased at the highest level of concentration. Besides that, there are a few subtle things here and there that are changed for certain moves. For instance, certain attacks deal more hits. Not only are these levels of concentration shown by the meter, but the effect or animations of your moves also hint that, with the highest level of concentration having the flashiest effects. If you're close to an enemy, you'll automatically gain concentration meter. How much concentration you gain depends on what you're doing. On the other hand, you'll lose concentration meter if you whiff hits, run around near an enemy, or take damage. It's a good concept in theory, but in practice not so much. Having 3 levels for each move, with every level having a subtle change in property, is a great concept. This is something that Nero's Exceed system does pretty well. In fact, you could argue that for his special moves he has 4 levels, the first one being his default attack, the second one being the first level of Exceed, the third one dealing a little bit more hits and damage than the previous one, and the final one does the most hits and the most damage. So if this concept basically exists with Nero, why don't I like it when it is applied to Vergil? It all has to do with control. How quickly and fluidly can I alter between these different levels of attacks? With Nero, if you press and hold the Exceed button several times, you will fill the Exceed meter. However, this takes quite a long time. Assuming you brought all the upgrades for this mechanic, your special attacks, such as Streak or Caliber, will deplete all that meter instantly. To make this mechanic more viable, the developers implemented X-Act and Max-Act. With a well-timed press of the Exceed button, you will be able to fill meter instantly. With X-Act, you only fill 1 bar of the Exceed meter, whereas Max-Act fills everything. This makes it very easy to switch between levels of Exceed mid-combo, instead of walking around recharging your Exceed meter at a very snail pace. There are a few limitations though. If you jump cancel a move before the time frame in which you can X-Act or Max-Act, you won't be able to X-Act or Max-Act. This means that, for example, you won't be able to jump cancel a bunch of double downs repeatedly, or jump cancel a bunch of Exceed Calibers. There are a few ways to get around this issue, but you will either have to sacrifice something, or it's just plain unreliable. Also, you'll rarely use Exceed level 2, because usually if you Exceed, you'll get to Exceed level 1, but if you Max-Act, you'll get to Exceed level 3. Not much is lost though, but overall, the Exceed system allows you to switch between different levels of moves much better than the concentration meter does for Vergil. And every level has its own pros and cons. For an arrow, a normal caliber will instantly knock the enemy away. However, an exceeded caliber will do several hits that stun first, and then do a knockback hit if an enemy is in the air but far away. Doing an exceed caliber and jump canceling before the final hit will get you close to the enemy without knocking it back like a normal caliber would. This may or may not be good depending on what you want. An example for Vergil would be his DT Stinger. With an aerial DT Stinger of concentration level 1 or 2, you could jump cancel it multiple times with a backwards inertia rave, but with concentration level 3 it's a lot harder to do, and I believe you could do 2 at most. This is why having the ability to change modes fluidly is so beneficial to the gameplay's depth. Basically, getting from one level of concentration to another immediately is pretty much impossible. Perhaps the fastest way to gain concentration meter is to simply stand still. It increases the concentration meter faster than just simply hitting the enemy and comboing on him. On the other hand, losing concentration meter is also pretty difficult to do quickly. Although it's common for players to whiff hits intentionally, it still takes a couple of hits in order to get from one level of concentration back to a lower level. The fastest way is probably just getting hit or staying on the ground and running around. For combat and combos, you could see why that's not a good option. And I don't think it does a good job making the player play like Vergil. A good example of this is taunting. If you taunt, your concentration meter doesn't go as fast as just simply standing still. I don't know about you, but that's something pretty lame to be rewarded for. But there are other smaller problems with this concentration meter too. To name one, if you hit a shield, it counts as whiffing a hit. So if you're fighting Credo and he keeps blocking you, well, there goes your concentration meter. There is a way around it, but it's kind of stupid, which is to teleport as soon as the hit connects. This is why other players and I play with the super costume. It's almost as if the concentration meter didn't exist. Again, in theory it's a good mechanic, but in execution it was pretty piss poor. So I don't want to deal with the headache of managing a poorly designed mechanic. This brings us to our final, and perhaps most severe for me anyways, problem, which is that Vergil does so much fucking damage. I cannot, no. He does a fuck ton of damage at max concentration, and this is made worse when you're in double trigger mode, which is necessary for a lot of things. As I mentioned before, you need it for trick down, as well as needing it for DT aerial stinger, which is basically your only source of horizontal movement for Vergil. And put those things aside for a moment, just the special abilities for summon swords, such as blistering sword or sword storm, do a ton of damage. You could refund certain abilities to downgrade the damage, but unfortunately this decreases the range of your summon swords, as well as lowering the amount of summon swords that a special ability has. And when it comes to a move like blistering swords, this hurts a major purpose for the move, which is to keep the enemy in the air, and now with less summon swords that means less air time. For a player like me who prioritizes on freestyle or battle videos, this problem is one of the biggest reasons I don't take him as seriously as Dante or Nero. And I mean, DMC4 is already a game with very weak enemies. In fact, my first major problem is that enemies die way too quickly, even with Dante. This is why I play a lot on GMD, but the funny thing is that GMD is not good enough to prevent Vergil from destroying everything in the blink of an eye. Combine that with his heavy crowd control, and you have a recipe for disaster. It's so bad that oftentimes I feel like not using the super costume, which will be my goal if I play Vergil heavily for a long period of time. But yes, those are my problems with Vergil. I may have missed a spot here and there, but whatever. Overall, I think Vergil in Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition is a deep character that I think beats the depth of Devil May Cry 3 Vergil, although maybe inferior to DMC Devil May Cry Vergil in terms of depth, mainly because of his doppelganger. So contrary to what other people might think, no, I don't hate Vergil completely. I just hate certain aspects of him, mainly because I hold that character to a higher standard. I'm sorry guys, just because you guys don't hold the game to a higher standard doesn't mean that when I criticize it, I hate that character. I love Vergil in Devil May Cry 3, and although Devil May Cry 3 Vergil, like any other character, had flaws, I don't dismiss them, so I have high standards for any new iteration of the same character, and just future Devil May Crys in general. Needless to say, it's very disappointing to see missed opportunities, as well as just very stupid design choices to affect the character that I would have enjoyed playing a lot more than I currently am. And believe me, Vergil is still enjoyable when playing against infinite health enemies, but I have a hard time saying the same outside of the lab. So take that as you will. Thanks for watching guys. Apologies for the very long video. I mean, I can't imagine how much longer this video would have been if it were a DMC4 SE critique video instead of just a Vergil critique. But whatever, I also rushed this video, so there's that. Anyways, thanks for watching guys, see you later.